The day Hollywood fell silent, the winter sun hung quietly over Los Angeles on the morning of December 28, 1995. A soft gray fog rolled across the hills of Westwood Village, settling gently around the tall palm trees and quiet streets. It was one of those rare California mornings when even the city that never seemed to pause had chosen silence. Outside Pierce Brothers' Westwood Village Memorial Park, hundreds of people stood behind velvet ropes. Some were fans. Some were journalists. Many were simply people who grew up listening to a voice that defined an entire generation. Inside the chapel lay Dean Martin. Singer, actor, comedian, one of the smoothest entertainers America had ever known. For decades, his voice had floated through radios and television sets across the world. Songs like That's Amore, Everybody Loves Somebody, and Volare had turned ordinary evenings into something magical. Now the man who once made millions laugh was gone. Dean Martin had passed away peacefully on Christmas Day at the age of 78. And Hollywood had come to say goodbye. The Chapel of Legends. The small chapel was filled far beyond capacity. Inside sat some of the most recognizable faces in entertainment history. Actors who had shared the screen with him. Musicians who had grown up inspired by him. Comedians who studied his timing like a master class. Frank Sinatra Jr. sat quietly near the front. Nearby were old friends from decades of show business, people who had once shared smoky nightclub stages, late-night jokes, and unforgettable performances. Some of them hadn't seen each other in years. But today, all of them had come for the same reason: to honor a man who had once defined cool. Outside, television trucks lined the street. Satellite dishes pointed toward the sky like mechanical sunflowers. Reporters whispered into microphones. Camera operators checked their focus. This wasn't just another celebrity funeral. It felt like the closing chapter of an era. A man steps out of a black car. At 10:46 a.m., a black sedan slowly pulled into the far corner of the parking lot. The driver stepped out first. Then the passenger door opened. A tall man in a black suit stepped onto the pavement. His movements were calm, deliberate. He wore dark sunglasses that hid most of his face from view. In his right hand was a black leather briefcase. Heavy, carefully held. For a moment he simply stood there, looking toward the chapel, listening to the quiet hum of distant voices and television crews. This wasn't just another funeral to him. This was the goodbye of a friend. A friendship few people understood. Long before the cameras. Long before the crowds. Before the legends. There had simply been two performers. Two men navigating the strange, overwhelming world of fame. They first met in the mid-1950s in Las Vegas, when the city was transforming into the entertainment capital of America. Dean Martin was already a star. Elvis Presley was just beginning to become something the world had never seen before. Their personalities were different. Dean had the relaxed charm of someone who made everything look effortless. Elvis had the nervous energy of a young man suddenly standing under the brightest spotlight imaginable. But they understood each other, because both of them knew something the public rarely saw. Fame could be loud, but it could also be lonely. And over the years, their respect turned into a quiet friendship. Not the kind displayed in headlines, but the kind built during private dinners, backstage conversations, and late-night phone calls. The man with the briefcase. The tall man adjusted his jacket and began walking toward the chapel entrance. Each step echoed softly across the pavement. No reporters noticed him yet. No photographers turned their cameras. He moved calmly through the crowd. Just another guest arriving to pay his respects. Inside the chapel, the service had already begun. Soft music played through hidden speakers. A minister stood at the front, speaking gently about Dean Martin's life. His voice echoed through the room. Stories about laughter, friendship, and the kind of charisma that could fill a room without effort. Many people in the audience smiled through tears. because every story sounded exactly like Dean. The doors open. At 10:47 a.m., the chapel doors slowly opened. A faint beam of sunlight slipped inside. Several people near the back of the room turned to see who had entered. For a moment, no one spoke. The tall man stood quietly in the doorway. Black suit, dark glasses, a briefcase in his hand. Something about him seemed strangely familiar. A few guests exchanged confused glances. The man began walking slowly down the center aisle. Each step steady, each movement deliberate. By the time he reached the middle of the room, whispers had begun spreading through the crowd. One person leaned toward another. Someone else squinted more closely. It couldn't be. Could it? The man stopped near the front row. He removed his sunglasses. And for a brief moment, the room seemed to forget how to breathe. Because standing there was Elvis Presley, a moment no one expected. The silence in the chapel became absolute. No cameras clicked. No one whispered. Even the minister paused mid-sentence. It had been nearly 2 decades since the world lost the man known as the king of rock and roll. Yet here he stood, older, quieter, but unmistakably the same man whose voice had once shaken stadiums. He looked toward the casket where Dean Martin rested peacefully. For a moment, Elvis said nothing. His expression softened. Not the expression of a superstar, but the expression of a man remembering a friend. The briefcase. Slowly, Elvis stepped closer. He placed the black briefcase gently on a small table beside the casket. The metal clasps clicked open. Inside were neatly stacked bundles of money. Exactly $100,000. No one in the room understood what they were witnessing. But Elvis did not look at the crowd. He looked only at Dean. Then, in a quiet voice that carried through the silent chapel, he spoke. Dean once told me that loyalty was the rarest thing in this business. He paused, and he was one of the few men who truly understood it. The room remained frozen. Elvis closed the briefcase, rested his hand gently on the casket, and whispered something only a few people close enough could hear. Thank you for being my friend. The beginning of a legend. No one moved for several seconds. Then Elvis quietly turned, picked up the briefcase, and walked slowly back toward the chapel doors. The whispers began again. Shock, confusion. A few people wiped tears from their eyes. Because whatever had just happened, it was something far deeper than a headline. It was a moment of respect, of memory, of friendship. And though no one fully understood the meaning of the money in that briefcase, everyone in that room felt the same thing. They had just witnessed something unforgettable. When the doors of the chapel closed behind Elvis Presley that morning, the silence inside the room lingered long after he had disappeared from sight. Many of the people seated in those rows would later say that the moment felt surreal, as if the air itself had shifted. For some, it felt like watching history suddenly rewrite itself. For others, it was simply the overwhelming realization that two of the most legendary figures in entertainment had shared a bond far deeper than the world had ever understood. But the story that brought Elvis to that chapel did not begin in 1995. It began decades earlier, long before the cameras, the headlines, and the myths surrounding both men had grown larger than life. The first time Elvis Presley met Dean Martin was in Las Vegas in the mid-1950s, when the desert city was becoming the center of American entertainment. Neon lights glowed across the strip, music spilled from hotel lounges, and performers from across the country traveled there hoping to make their mark. At that time, Dean Martin was already one of the most recognizable entertainers in the world. His smooth voice, relaxed humor, and effortless charm had made him a favorite on stage and television. He had mastered the art of making every performance feel spontaneous, as if he were simply having fun rather than carefully delivering a perfectly timed show. Elvis Presley, on the other hand, was still new to that world of fame. He had already begun transforming music with a sound that electrified younger audiences, but the whirlwind of attention surrounding him was overwhelming. The crowd screamed his name wherever he went. Photographers followed his every movement, and the expectations placed on him seemed to grow heavier each day. On one warm evening in Las Vegas, Elvis quietly slipped into the audience of one of Dean Martin's late-night performances. He sat near the back of the room, hoping to watch unnoticed. But Dean had a habit of observing his audience carefully. As he sang and joked with the crowd, his eyes scanned the room. Suddenly he stopped mid-song and smiled in a way that suggested he had spotted something interesting. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dean said casually into the microphone, "I believe we've got some royalty hiding in the back tonight." The audience turned in curiosity as Dean pointed toward Elvis. "Come on up here, kid," Dean said with a grin. "Let's see if you can sing without the band." The crowd erupted with excitement as Elvis hesitated for a moment before walking to the stage. He was nervous. Standing beside Dean Martin in front of a packed room of seasoned Las Vegas guests was very different from performing for teenagers at concerts. Dean handed him the microphone and stepped back slightly, giving him the space to sing. Elvis chose a quiet song, one that relied entirely on his voice. The room gradually fell silent as he sang. When he finished, Dean began clapping slowly, and within seconds the entire audience joined him in a standing ovation. After the applause faded, Dean placed a hand on Elvis's shoulder and leaned toward him with a warm smile. "You're going to be just fine, kid," he said. That brief moment marked the beginning of something neither of them expected. Over the years that followed, their friendship developed in ways that remained largely invisible to the public. They spoke often, sometimes sharing long phone conversations late at night when the noise of fame finally quieted down. Both men understood something that few others could fully grasp. Being adored by millions did not necessarily mean being understood by anyone. Dean had experienced the rise and fall of fame long before Elvis arrived on the scene. He had seen how the industry could celebrate someone one moment and move on the next. Because of that, he often gave Elvis advice about how to navigate the strange pressures of celebrity life. Elvis listened carefully to those conversations. Despite his enormous success, he respected Dean's calm perspective and his ability to remain grounded even when the spotlight grew intense. Dean never treated Elvis like a cultural phenomenon. To him, Elvis was simply a talented young man who needed guidance and friendship. Their bond grew stronger during difficult times as well. When Elvis lost his mother in 1958, he struggled with grief in a way that shocked those around him. Dean reached out privately, offering quiet support without any publicity or fanfare. Years later, when Dean faced personal tragedies of his own, Elvis was among the few who understood the depth of his pain. Through all of those years, their friendship remained steady. The public saw two superstars. But behind the curtain, they were simply two men who trusted each other. One evening many years later, during a private dinner in Los Angeles, Dean made a comment that Elvis would never forget. "You know what the hardest thing about this business is?" Dean asked. Elvis shook his head. "Finding someone who's honest when nobody else is around," Dean replied. Elvis nodded slowly, understanding exactly what he meant. That was the kind of friendship they shared. Not built on headlines, not built on publicity, but built on loyalty. And loyalty, as Elvis would later say, was the rarest currency in the world they lived in. Years passed, careers evolved. Both men became icons whose influence reached far beyond music and film. Yet whenever their paths crossed, they greeted each other with the same genuine warmth they had shared since that first night in Las Vegas. In the unpredictable world of entertainment, where alliances often shifted and friendships sometimes faded, their bond remained something surprisingly simple. They trusted each other, and that trust would eventually lead to a promise that neither man could ever forget. A promise remembered. The world often remembers celebrities for their performances, their awards, and their public achievements. But the moments that shape their lives most deeply usually occur far from cameras and audiences. For Elvis Presley and Dean Martin, one such moment happened during a quiet conversation many years before that final morning in 1995. It was the early 1970s, a period when both men had already experienced extraordinary success, but were also beginning to feel the weight of decades spent in the public eye. Elvis had been performing relentlessly, traveling across the country for concerts that drew enormous crowds. Dean, meanwhile, continued hosting television shows, recording music, and appearing in films. Despite their accomplishments, both men understood the personal toll that constant fame could bring. Their schedules were exhausting, their privacy limited, and the expectations placed upon them rarely allowed for rest. One evening after a performance in Las Vegas, the two friends found themselves sitting together in a quiet lounge after the crowd had gone home. The lights of the Strip flickered outside the window as they spoke about life beyond the stage. Dean sipped his drink slowly while Elvis leaned back in his chair, looking thoughtful. "You ever think about what people will say about us years from now?" Elvis asked. Dean chuckled softly. "Probably a lot of things that aren't true," he replied. Elvis smiled at the answer but then grew serious. "I mean it," he said, "when it's all over." Dean studied his friend for a moment before answering. "What matters isn't what they say," he said calmly. "What matters is who shows up when the music stops." Elvis considered that statement carefully. Dean continued, his voice steady. "In this business, people clap when you're on stage, but the real measure of a man is who stands beside you when the lights go out." The conversation lingered in Elvis's mind for years. He thought about it whenever he faced difficult moments, whenever fame felt overwhelming, and whenever he questioned whether the world truly understood him beyond the image it had created. Dean's words were simple, but they carried truth, and Elvis never forgot them. Decades later, when Dean Martin passed away and the world gathered to honor him, those words echoed again in Elvis's memory. The lights had gone out. The music had ended. And Elvis knew exactly what kind of friend he wanted to be. That was why he had come to the chapel that morning. Not for attention, not for headlines, but because a promise made between two friends was something he believed should never be forgotten. As Elvis drove away from the Memorial Park that afternoon, the city around him buzzed with confusion and speculation. Reporters rushed to broadcast the astonishing news that he had appeared at the funeral. Fans across the country struggled to understand what they had witnessed. But Elvis himself remained quiet. Because the most important part of that day was not the crowd, the cameras, or the rumors. It was the quiet moment he had shared beside Dean Martin's casket. A moment where gratitude replaced fame, and friendship proved stronger than legend. The weight of loyalty. After leaving the Memorial Park that morning, Elvis Presley drove through the quiet streets of Los Angeles without any clear destination in mind. The city looked familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Decades earlier, these same streets had been filled with premieres, concerts, recording studios, and endless flashes of cameras following him from one place to another. Now, as he passed through Beverly Hills and Westwood, the world outside his car seemed almost distant, like a memory rather than the life he once lived. Inside the car, Elvis held the steering wheel with both hands and allowed his thoughts to drift backward through the years. The funeral had stirred emotions he had not felt in a long time. Seeing Dean Martin's casket had brought back memories not just of the friendship they shared, but of the era they both helped shape. It reminded him of nights in Las Vegas when the Strip felt like the center of the universe, when the Rat Pack ruled the entertainment world, and when audiences filled every theater just to hear a voice that could make them laugh, cry, or dance. Dean Martin had always possessed a special kind of calmness that Elvis admired. While other performers chased the spotlight with intensity, Dean moved through fame with a relaxed confidence that made everything appear effortless. He joked easily with audiences, sang as if he were simply enjoying a conversation with the room, and rarely seemed concerned about critics or public opinion. To Elvis, that attitude represented a kind of freedom that many entertainers struggled to achieve. During the years when Elvis's fame exploded into something unprecedented, he often found himself overwhelmed by the expectations surrounding him. Every performance was examined, every interview dissected, every decision judged by millions of people who believed they understood him simply because they had heard his music. In those moments, the quiet advice Dean offered became incredibly valuable. Dean never tried to lecture him or pretend he had all the answers. Instead, he spoke with the perspective of someone who had already navigated the unpredictable waves of fame. He once told Elvis that success in entertainment could feel like standing under a spotlight that never turned off. "If you stay there too long," Dean said, "the light starts to burn." Elvis remembered those words clearly. Dean believed that artists needed moments of silence between the applause, moments when they could step away from the noise and remember who they were before the world started calling their name. That idea stayed with Elvis throughout his career, even when the demands of performing made such quiet moments difficult to find. Their friendship deepened over the years through conversations that rarely appeared in magazines or television interviews. When Elvis visited Los Angeles, the two often met for dinner in small restaurants where they could talk without distractions. Sometimes they discussed music or films, but more often they talked about life itself. Dean had a gift for turning even serious discussions into moments of humor, and Elvis appreciated that ability to bring lightness to heavy topics. One evening during the early 1970s, they sat together on the balcony of a hotel overlooking the lights of Las Vegas. The city stretched across the desert like a glowing ocean of neon signs and casino marquees. Elvis leaned against the railing while Dean relaxed in a chair, watching the crowds below. "Funny place," Elvis said quietly as he looked at the strip. Dean smiled slightly. "Why, yes, that?" Elvis thought for a moment before answering. "Everyone comes here chasing excitement, but after a while it starts to feel like the same night over and over again." Dean nodded in agreement. He had spent countless nights performing in those casinos and understood exactly what Elvis meant. Fame could sometimes feel like living inside a repeating performance where the scenery changed, but the routine remained the same. "You know what matters most," Dean said after a pause. Elvis turned to look at him. "The people who remember you when the crowd goes home," Dean replied. That statement captured something Elvis had sensed for years. The cheers of an audience were powerful and unforgettable, but they were temporary. When the stage lights dimmed and the theater emptied, what remained were the friendships that had been built behind the scenes. Dean Martin had been one of those rare friends who treated Elvis like a human being rather than a symbol. He never spoke to him as the king. Instead, he addressed him simply as Elvis, a talented musician and a man navigating the same complicated world of fame that Dean himself had experienced. As Elvis drove through Los Angeles after the funeral, those memories filled his mind with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. Dean's absence felt enormous. The entertainment industry had lost many remarkable figures over the years, but Dean's passing seemed to represent the closing of an entire chapter of American culture. The Rat Pack era had been defined by charisma, humor, and an effortless sense of style. Dean Martin, Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., and their companions had created an atmosphere of showmanship that blended music, comedy, and friendship in a way audiences adored. Elvis had admired that spirit long before he became a legend himself. Although their careers followed different paths, Elvis always felt a connection to that generation of performers who approached entertainment with both confidence and warmth. Dean, in particular, represented the idea that a performer could achieve immense success while still maintaining humility and kindness. That was why Elvis had come to the funeral with the briefcase. The money itself was not meant to create spectacle. It was a personal gesture meant to express gratitude for years of friendship and quiet support. Elvis believed that loyalty deserved to be honored in a meaningful way. The amount was symbolic, representing the countless conversations, encouragement, and trust that had defined their relationship. As he continued driving, Elvis eventually stopped near a quiet overlook where the city's skyline spread out beneath the afternoon sun. He stepped out of the car and leaned against the hood, gazing toward the horizon. For a long moment he stood there without speaking, reflecting on how quickly time moved. The entertainment world had changed dramatically since the early days when he and Dean first met. New artists, new styles, and new audiences had emerged, but the memories of those earlier years remained vivid in his mind. Elvis understood that legacies were often shaped by the stories people told after someone was gone. Fans remembered songs, films, and performances, but the deeper truths about a person's character were usually shared only by those who knew them personally. Dean Martin's legacy, in Elvis's eyes, was not defined solely by his famous songs or television shows. It was defined by the kindness he showed to others, the humor he used to lift people's spirits, and the loyalty he demonstrated to the friends who stood beside him through decades of fame. Standing there above the city, Elvis quietly whispered a few words that no reporters or cameras would ever capture. "Thank you, Dean." The wind moved softly across the hillside, carrying his voice away into the vast sky above Los Angeles. In that moment, Elvis felt something he had not experienced since hearing the news of Dean's passing. Peace, because honoring his friend had been the right thing to do. And some friendships, he believed, deserved to be remembered not through speeches or headlines, but through simple acts of respect that spoke louder than words. The story of Elvis Presley and Dean Martin was not just about music or fame. It was about two men who understood the pressures of an extraordinary life and chose to support each other with honesty and loyalty. Long after the crowds left the memorial park and the cameras turned away, that friendship remained the most important part of the day Elvis walked into the chapel. And the meaning of that moment would continue to grow as people began to understand the deeper story behind it. The legacy of two legends. As the afternoon sun slowly faded over Los Angeles on the day of Dean Martin's funeral, the city returned to its usual rhythm. Traffic filled the streets, television stations replayed the events of the morning, and conversations about the memorial spread across newsrooms, living rooms, and cafes throughout the country. Yet for many people who had witnessed the service inside the chapel, the moment Elvis Presley walked down the aisle would remain etched in their memories for the rest of their lives. It was not simply the surprise of seeing one of the most iconic figures in music history appear unexpectedly. What stayed with people was the quiet dignity of the moment. Elvis had not entered the room seeking attention, applause, or recognition. He had walked toward the casket of a friend with the calm determination of someone fulfilling a personal obligation that meant far more than any public performance. The briefcase he carried that day soon became a topic of widespread discussion. Reporters debated its meaning, commentators speculated about the symbolism, and fans shared their own interpretations of what the gesture represented. Some believed it was Elvis's way of repaying a debt of gratitude, while others saw it as a final tribute from one legend to another. Yet the truth was simpler than most people imagined. For Elvis, the money was never about spectacle or publicity. It was a physical reminder of something Dean Martin had taught him many years earlier. In the world of entertainment, loyalty was more valuable than wealth, more meaningful than applause, and more enduring than fame. The briefcase represented a message that words alone could not fully express. Dean Martin had spent decades making audiences laugh and sing along to melodies that became part of everyday life. His relaxed style created the illusion that performing came effortlessly to him, but those who knew him understood the dedication behind that smooth confidence. He believed that entertainers had a responsibility not only to entertain, but also to bring people together through shared moments of joy. Elvis admired that philosophy deeply. Throughout his career, he had seen how music could unite strangers, lift spirits during difficult times, and create memories that lasted long after the final note faded. Dean approached entertainment with that same understanding, and it was one of the many reasons Elvis respected him so profoundly. In the days following the funeral, stories about Dean Martin's generosity began resurfacing in newspapers and television interviews. Colleagues remembered the countless times he supported fellow performers behind the scenes without seeking recognition. Younger artists recalled moments when he offered encouragement during uncertain points in their careers. Friends spoke about the quiet kindness he showed to those around him, often in ways the public never witnessed. These stories painted a picture of a man whose influence extended far beyond his famous recordings and television appearances. Dean Martin had become a symbol of warmth and camaraderie in an industry that could sometimes feel competitive and isolating. His humor made people feel comfortable, his music created lasting memories, and his presence reminded audiences that entertainment could be both elegant and joyful. Elvis understood all of that as well as anyone. Their friendship had given him a glimpse into the character behind Dean's public image. While fans saw the charming performer on stage, Elvis knew the thoughtful friend who offered advice during difficult times and celebrated successes with genuine happiness. That understanding was what made the funeral so meaningful for him. Standing beside Dean's casket, Elvis was not thinking about headlines or public reactions. He was remembering the countless moments they shared over the years, the conversations after concerts, the laughter during late-night dinners, and the quiet respect they held for each other's work. As news of the memorial spread across the world, fans began reflecting on the extraordinary contributions both men had made to music and culture. Elvis Presley had revolutionized popular music with his powerful voice and energetic performances, creating a sound that reshaped the landscape of rock and roll. Dean Martin, meanwhile, had built a career that blended singing, comedy, and acting into a style uniquely his own. Together, their legacies represented different yet complementary chapters in entertainment history. Elvis embodied the explosive energy of a new musical era, while Dean represented the smooth sophistication of classic showmanship. Both approaches captivated audiences and influenced generations of performers who followed. In the weeks after the funeral, many journalists attempted to analyze the deeper meaning of Elvis's appearance. Some suggested it symbolized the enduring bond between artists who understood each other's struggles and triumphs. Others believed it illustrated the timeless power of friendship within an industry often defined by competition. But those closest to the two men offered a simpler explanation. Elvis had come to say goodbye to a friend. That was all. As months turned into years, the memory of that moment gradually transformed into a story shared among fans and historians alike. The image of Elvis walking calmly through the chapel with a briefcase in his hand became part of the folklore surrounding both legends. It was retold in documentaries, articles, and conversations about the golden age of entertainment. Yet beyond the dramatic details of the event, the deeper lesson remained rooted in the values both men represented. Their friendship demonstrated that genuine connections could exist even within the whirlwind of celebrity life. Despite the pressures of fame and the constant attention of the public, Elvis Presley and Dean Martin had managed to maintain a relationship built on trust and respect. In many ways, that bond reflected the same spirit that defined their music. Dean's songs often celebrated love, laughter, and companionship, while Elvis's performances captured the emotional intensity of human experience. Both artists used their talents to express universal feelings that audiences everywhere could understand. The tribute Elvis offered at the funeral served as a reminder that behind every legendary career lies a personal story filled with friendships, challenges, and moments of quiet reflection. Fame may elevate individuals to extraordinary heights, but it is the relationships they nurture along the way that ultimately shape their lives. Years later, visitors to Westwood Memorial Park continued to stop at Dean Martin's resting place, leaving flowers and notes expressing admiration for his work. Many of them had grown up listening to his music or watching his performances with family members. His voice remained a comforting presence that connected generations through timeless melodies. For those who knew about the events of that December morning, the memorial site carried an additional layer of meaning. It represented not only the life of a beloved entertainer, but also the enduring friendship between two men whose influence reached far beyond the stage. The story of Elvis Presley walking into Dean Martin's funeral with a briefcase would always spark curiosity. Yet the true significance of that moment was never about the briefcase itself. It was about the respect Elvis felt for a man who had stood beside him throughout decades of change and success. In honoring Dean Martin, Elvis honored something even greater. He honored loyalty. He honored friendship. And he honored the idea that some bonds remain unbreakable, no matter how much time passes. In the end, that was the legacy both men left behind. Not just songs that filled concert halls or performances that entertained millions, but a reminder that kindness, trust, and loyalty are the qualities that truly define greatness. Long after the applause fades and the stage lights dim, those values continue to echo through the stories people share. And in that quiet echo, the friendship between Elvis Presley and Dean Martin lives on.